This is Phillip, and Phillip has been, and I'm going to refer to my notes, but I think you've been doing archaeology for 15 years, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And on top of being here, you're getting a PhD at Pitt, and your specialty, I have to look at this, is colonial Black Sea archaeology, is that correct?
Yep.
Incredible. You have to explain to us what that means.
Okay.
Yeah, because I don't know. And you're also, I didn't know this about, you're a recovery expert for the Department of Prisoner of War and, right, MIA, accountability?
Yep.
And you do that in the summers?
Yeah, I go over to places like Vietnam, and there's an investigative team, and we go and they hire archaeologists to actually excavate and document the actual recovery of whether it's a plane crash or somebody that was buried in combat or something like that, so that it's legally defensible, basically. So they use the scientific method instead of just, digging around until they find the body and then taking it away. So.
And we're lucky to have you here.
Yeah.
Phillip is an interpreter.
Yep.
And you do other things for the Carnegie too, don't you?
A few things, Boy Scouts and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
and your master's degree, can you explain this one? I wrote down that you went to the European University of St. Petersburg.
Yep. Yeah, it just reopened this year. So it's one of only 2 private universities in Russia. So they get a lot of grief from the government, if you can imagine why. So it's part of the European university system, which actually brings in people from outside Russia to study Russian culture. So you can study sociology, history, anthropology, archaeology, which is what I did. So I learned about Russian archaeology, how the Russian methods, things like that, and then I can take that back and use that for a PhD study.
So we're in for a treat today.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're so lucky. I told you, the Carnegie, we're very fortunate.
Yep.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, today's December 21st, which is the winter solstice, right? And it's also what's called a cold moon, because we have a full moon on this day, which is recognized in a lot of cultures. I don't know about Egypt, but in the Mayan system, a cold moon on the solstice was a very special event. So on the Temple of the Moon down in Mexico, they would have had celebrations of all day today. So the Egyptians also followed a sun and a moon system, so I wouldn't be surprised if they had a celebration today. And the next one's actually going to be 70 years from now, where we're going to have a full moon on this type of day, so that would have been very cool. So a little bit about myself. So I do work for the DPAA. That's a relatively new position for me. It's based out of Hawaii, and then they, because of Pearl Harbor and what happened there, this has been going on in Vietnam for it's the 30th year, so which actually opened up diplomatic relationships with Vietnam to actually recover our fallen soldiers. And now we do what we call Vietnamese recovery teams, where we'll have an entire Vietnamese component, and they pay for our time there, and then in exchange we train them how to recover their own dead. So but we're here to talk about ancient Egypt. So what makes this hall special, at least as far as I'm concerned, is actually that this hall is about daily life. It's about regular Egyptian and how most of them would have lived through most of their culture, right? So I guess we should move on inside. Yeah. So I guess during the intro, you guys were learning about the 5,000 or so years of Egyptian history. That's a lot of chronology. So that's a lot to get your hands around. And even in the later Egyptian periods, they disagreed with how their own history was being told. So that's why we have these different periods of Egyptian relationships between the pharaoh and the people. So it went from kind of being the pharaoh was an absolute god, unquestionable, the only one that went to the afterlife, and then it slowly trickled down. By the time you got to Tutankhamun, you had what you called like a hero king, who was still loosely related to the gods, still would become a god in the afterlife, but it was more of an inclusive system. So we tend to think Egypt was very static, but because the way that we look at their artwork tells us there wasn't a whole lot of change in that 5,000 years. But there was actually a lot of things, and I think that's what's very important about this collection, is that you can show this chronology. I think that's important to kind of give people the depth and the length of a culture. 5,000 years is a long time compared to a country that's, what, 243 years old? So that's minuscule in comparison. But archaeology in general has started to see its collections very differently. So looking at this stuff is arranged in chronological order, which is important to tell difference and change. But what also is very important is not to see these as timepieces, but as things that people used. So that's kind of the newer direction of archaeology, is to look at household architecture, to look at how households were arranged, how people were working in relationship to each other. The 90%, 99% of people remain part of the archaeological record, but what they left behind is just used to tell time. And archaeology has really tried to move beyond that, and tell the story of the people that used these types of material. So some of the earlier wares we can use from the pre-dynastic period. We have things like the makeup palette, which I kind of disagree with as being identified as such, and about the different types of ceramic wares. I really like these pieces because of the way that they were made. It's very, very interesting. The red comes from a high amount of oxygen, and then the black is oxygen reduction. So when you're actually burying the type of the top of the pot, you have to flip it upside down and stick it to the ground in organic material like ash or carbon or something like that, and that's what gives its burnished wear. So there's no practical reason to do that, right? So in fact, there's a lot of different other types of ware or ceramic vessels that can function without that. So these questions come up of why were they doing these type of things? Why decorate? Why cover? Why burnish at different levels? So this is some of the questions that modern archaeology is trying to ask. Was it a functional use, or was it aesthetic, or was it identifying culture? Was it saying this is ours and this is your type of wares? So when I'm taking people through these tours, through this hall, I'm trying to get them to think about these things as objects, as things that people use and wear, not just timepieces. So now the main thing over here, the main showcase item, is our Egyptian boat. So which I spend a lot of time talking about this boat for a number of reasons. So it's one of our few, in comparison to the rest of the collection, it's one of the few objects that we have that belonged to an actual pharaoh. So Senusret III, around the 1870s BC, which is also very contemporaneous with this model boat. But this artifact in particular, I like to point out the construction of the boat. It's not very well made, and there's no oar planks. It's basically a towing boat or a tugboat that was taken from one side of the Nile to the other side and buried outside of Senusret III's Egyptian pyramid complex, which is also very important to recognize that it wasn't just the pyramid that was constructed for Egyptian pharaohs. That was just the centerpiece. Most of it was surrounded by an outside wall that separated the sacred from the profane, and it made it kind of an activity center. These things, I like to think of them as kind of like a presidential library. So each pharaoh or each president that goes through their reign gets to pick out a presidential library, even if they serve 4, 8, or 6 months. And that becomes a living legacy of that person. So as well as a place for employment. So for other people that are involved in the government. So these were buried outside, preserved quite well. And there's a lot that we can tell about it just from its construction. If we move over here to the modeling, the two models over here, we can see that this was constructed without the planking system. So these things are set end to end. There's no overlap. And none of the pieces of the boat were steamed or planked into place. You know, if you've ever built like a wooden model ship or seen a canoe or a kayak, there's a lot that goes into actually bending the wood into shape. The Egyptians actually didn't know how to do that. These pieces are actually too thick to do that. So they had to carve it. They had to carve the shape of the boat into place. And that produced a lot of extra waste, but that's the way they knew how to do it. So this was an extremely expensive venture, probably only used for one trip. You can see how much space is in between each one of these boards here. They would have been covered in kind of a reed matting system, which you can see in the fully reconstructed model. So that would have provided some waterproof wear. But this thing was, even on its first voyage, was probably quite leaky. And so it was only used to ferry things from one side of the Nile to the other at greatest extent. So the model here, which is contemporaneous but within the same century as this, was buried with someone else that is believed to be kind of a merchant, or at least somebody involved in trade. There are a number of different characters that are missing from the model. And the presumed leader, or the presumed owner of the boat here in front, you can kind of see some small attachments where they would have attached their Egyptian beard. So when you're looking at Egyptian iconography, the beard was something that you added on, like a pair of glasses. It wasn't something you actually grew. So very different. So Egyptians didn't actually like body hair, which I'll get into a little bit later, but they did wear wigs and beards as fashion. So a couple of pieces were probably added to this to make it more complete. The sail, which is in the back of the model here, it doesn't quite match the rest of the wood. So this was probably added from another model before a sail. And the oar doesn't look like it attaches very well, and that's probably because it wasn't part of the original model. So that doesn't mean that this was added during modern times. A lot of these things were looted between 4,000 years ago and today, and they ended up in a lot of different hands, and that gives a lot of time for adding these types of things. So it's almost part of the history of the object, is having these loosely associated objects with the models. So Egyptians were not against looting from earlier models or earlier tombs. So this is 4,000 or 5,000 years. Things are rode out of the bank, things crack open. They would go inside and repurpose a lot of these artifacts. It can be a headache in modern archaeology to find tombs or burials that contain a multitude of different time period artifacts within the same thing. So that's just because they're finding these things and repurposing them for their own burials. So, okay, so I guess we'll move on over here. Again, this is very different than other Egyptian collections in museums that you'll see around the world, because it's organized around daily life. Each one of these display cases kind of gives you a sample of what you could actually find in everyday households and everyday burials. Most of the artifacts that we recover in Egypt today are from burial contexts. Houses were always repurposed, so people like to take their things with them. Egyptian afterlife was a reflection of this life. It was just kind of life 2.0. So everything that you needed had to be taken with you to a certain extent, including food and other type of offerings. We have a stele on the outside of the wall on the other side that was part of a tomb chapel where several tombs entered into a common chapel where you could give offerings to each one of the ancestors. And the owner of this chapel was so specific. He didn't want the generic food offerings and drink offerings. He actually listed line item what was his favorite bread and what was his favorite ale, and when to bring that type of favorite ale. So this was very specific offerings for what he wanted to give. So some of the more common objects, I like to start with this one because a lot of people will come in and recognize the things that they see here. The fish hooks, even the gardening hoe, that was a common item. And then I move usually to a little bit more confusing objects like this bronze mirror. So this was something, this is a little bit later because it's bronze. Most of early Egyptian culture was in the Chalcolithic or the Copper Age. A lot of the granite and sandstone artifacts from that period were carved with copper, which is incredibly difficult. Copper is, if you have a copper bracelet or anything else, you can bend it with your hands. So if you imagine trying to carve granite with that's a lot of resharpening. It's probably a couple of chisels, and then you're immediately resharpening the tool. But anyway, so this is a bronze mirror, which would have been polished to an extent where you can actually see your reflection. It's not the best reflection. I guess it's the equivalent of seeing your reflection in a steel or a still bowl of water, or something like that, or still pond. So just enough to put on all of that heavy makeup that Egyptians like to wear. And so pretty common artifacts that you'll see are razors, whetstones, tweezers, and all sorts of things for plucking eyebrows, shaving. Like I said before, Egyptians didn't like body hair. So a lot of men and women would shave their heads bald and then put on wigs as adornment. So, as well as getting rid of the rest of their body hair. They would also use, like Greeks, the ancient Greeks, they would use olive oil as kind of an aftershave and kind of to get rid of that razor burn. So, let's see. Yep, we'll move on to artifacts. Let's see. I guess we'll move over here. So, have you guys talked about the Egyptian headrest yet? So, this object right here, and we have one in the resource room. It represents an Egyptian headrest, and I really like pointing out this one because this is the kind of the Egyptian equivalent of a pillow. So, and it looks incredibly uncomfortable. So this one, in fact, probably wasn't used in real life or in living life, but it was actually used for the dead in the afterlife. The column and the actual head resting portion are just kind of glued into place. This is something that was probably carved as three separate pieces and then assembled. There's a space that was supposed to take a name, and it didn't actually take the name, so this might have been just in the store and then not actually used. It would have gone behind the neck of the person resting, so not actually on the head. And if you picture this in relation to our modern beds, this probably wouldn't work very well. But if you take the Egyptian style bed, which would have had a nice rope bedding to it, a nice sag to it, this would have actually provided a decent amount of head and neck rest. So also, if you're not wealthy enough to actually afford a bed that's off the ground and you had to sleep on the ground, usually in sand, this also affixes itself very, very nice to keep your head out of the sand. So those are some of the benefits for using that type of headrest. So, okay. Oh, here it is. This is the stela I was talking about before. So this object right here was affixed into a family chapel. It shows the standard offerings that they're giving to the different Egyptian gods, and then in the lower portions of the writing, it goes into what the owner of the tomb actually wants to have, right? Specific ales and specific breads. So in Old Egyptian, did you guys get into Egyptian writing too much? No? Okay. So Old Egyptian, all of the characters that you see here are just the consonants. So the Egyptians didn't write their vowels. It was assumed that you knew what the sounds were. This was just kind of a guide to the lettering. So when people would read these things, they would just kind of fill in the blanks. It was kind of like shorthand for text messaging. So that's caused a lot of different problems, mostly for pronunciation. So the names of Egyptian gods, where we put in the vowels, that's a best guess estimate. So on how to pronounce these things. So there's Osiris, for example. Those letters could be slightly changed. We just don't know. In certain cases, like the goddess Isis, which was the wife of Horus in the afterlife, Isis became very popular in the early Greek and Roman period. Even where I work on the northern Black Sea, there was a temporary Isis phenomenon where Greeks in the northern Black Sea were worshiping Isis for a while. And we know how to say that name. So some of these names are transposed from other sources, like Roman and Greek sources, where they were pronouncing the name and writing it in Latin or Greek. So that kind of gives us an example. But there could also be a dialectual change in that as well. So that could be just the way that they're saying it. So that makes a big difference. The other source has to do with these Coptic writings in late Egyptian. So there is still a certain amount of what I would call original or indigenous Egyptians. Today, Egypt speaks a variation of Arabic. They have their own dialect of that language. The Coptics, the Christians that are there today, are the Christianized ancient Egyptians, or the very far descendants of those groups. So, and even today, some of their chanting of old Coptic that they will still sing in church is basically a stylized version of late Egyptian. So there's just a little bit of late Egyptian language that's still being spoken today. A lot of that was written down at various sources, so there's a link, and if you can go from one source to the next and make those connections, you can get back to ancient ancient Egyptian and guess on those vowel sounds. So, but we're talking about 4 or 5 degrees of change between them, which if you look at the difference between Old English and New English, you can see the difference, and that's only 3 degrees of change. So it's a very, very difficult concept to kind of get these languages into a spoken form from their written form. So, okay, I guess we'll move around the corner. This room is I use this part of the room and part of the exhibit a lot to tell about not just Egyptian temple culture, but also about Egyptian fashion and Egyptian style. So all Egyptian wares were based on this type of plain white linen, and the designs and the styles that you see in Egyptian iconography, all of those designs that they're wearing on their clothes is actually beadwork. So they would wear very elaborate systems of beads that would cover, in some cases, the entire body. And then when they wanted to change their clothes or their fashion, if they wanted to change their style, they would take off that set of beads and put on another set of beads. Or if they just needed to change their linens, they were dirty, they could take off the beads, change their linens, and then put the beads back on. So that is how they wear their fashion. They didn't actually dye their clothes in different colors. It was the beads that provided the different types of wear. So if we look over here at these guys, these are Egyptian priests per se. Actually, the models that they the mannequins that you're actually looking at are basketball players from the University of Pittsburgh that were casted and molded. They were from Egypt. They're actually quite tall for Egyptians, so you have to kind of look past that. But they were using Egyptians at that time, in their late 80s, early 90s. And what they're doing here is they're actually in the production process of making more beads. So even though they are priests working in the temple, because of the Egyptians' lack of a monetary system, a lot of these temples, in addition to being the temple of a particular god, had to have a type of side business to exchange wares. So a lot of Egyptian temples were very exclusive pieces of architecture. Only the priests and the upper class were allowed regular access to Egyptian temples. Most people were only allowed access into temples when they were making an offering, or in special circumstances, or special festivals and things like that. So there was very, very little interaction with most of the population and a given temple. So to compensate for that, so that the priests could earn a living, is that they produced certain things. Some of the gods worshipped came along with the business. So if you were working in Osiris's temple, you could practice mummification as a service provided, but others needed to actually produce wares themselves. So that's why we see a lot of Egyptian temples in these kind of manufacturing centers on site. So these kind of cottage industries that were attached to temples were not separate entities. They were actually part of the temple complex system, part of the economy. So you have to realize that there are so many different Egyptian gods per city that religion was part of the economy. It was part of the regular everyday life, because Egyptian life was preparing you for the longer version of the real life that was to continue. It was considered part of the everyday life to just do all of these different things for these temples, to prepare in these different ways. So, okay, guess we will move on over here. A lot of what people want to see when you come here is the mummies. So it's a very condensed area, but there's a lot of information that you can pull out of this area. Namely, the mummification process was something that developed over a very extended period of time. If we look at the first pre-dynastic burial over here, I like to point out this on how Egyptians slowly found out about the mummification process. And so Egyptian soils, the sands and the Piedmonts that are eroding out of western Egypt contain a lot of nitrates and other natural preserving elements in the sand. In addition to being sand, which is in itself a great preservative of bodies, when I excavate burials, whether it's in sandy environments like Florida or the large like glacial sediment sands that are in Boston, if they're buried down in these coarse-grained sands, the sands will act as a sponge and pull water away, moisture away from the body as it's decomposing and as it's drying out. So it desiccates the bones, just burying it in sand. So before Egyptians started to actually mummify professionally, what they did was they buried their bodies in the ground like many cultures do. And over the course of thousands of years, these bodies would erode out of the hillside naturally, and they noticed their extraordinary state of preservation. So what Egyptians did to actually mummify bodies was just to build on this natural process. That's why a lot of mummification processes would pack the body in sand for 40 days to allow that natural leaching of moisture. And so they would enhance these things by taking out the organs, which I'll get into a little bit later with the canopic jars. But nature did most of the work here. So I also like to point out the age of this early burial, this early mummy, which this is 3060 or 3650 BC. So this is 5,650 years old. So a midpoint between us and this guy is Socrates. So Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, was just as old or just as difference in age between this guy and Socrates as we are from Socrates to now. So that's how much time has passed to give people this duration of this culture here. Humans were not the only thing that was mummified. All sorts of different fauna, animal creatures were made as offerings, mostly, depending on the god that was in question. You would offer things as food offerings or as symbols to that god or goddess. So you have things like the baby crocodile, which was offered, could be offered to a god of that choosing that could transform into that. You would do those for favors to show that you recognize that god can transform into those different animals, and you can also use it to ask for specific favors. Or in the case of the perch, you could send these mummified objects or mummified meals with the afterlife, so that the person that you're giving it to would have preserved meal, or even the living creature could manifest itself in the afterlife to be raised as livestock or some other reason like that. One of my favorites is this falcon here. Falcons were trained birds of prey, often pets. So this could have been offered either to represent the god Horus himself, or it could have been used as a hunting aid for the person that's living in the afterlife, or for simply having a pet. So falcons are often kept as pets. So cats were often mummified for both household reasons. The Egyptians were the ones that domesticated the North African wildcat, which looks pretty much like your household cat today. They're a little bit bigger, they have a little bit longer legs, but you still get that same distinctive domesticated cat face. We even know when they did this. They wrote it down. 13th dynasty, 2025 BC is when we started to see domesticated cat bones. And recently, we found that they started to export domesticated cats to the rest of the Mediterranean world. So up in Cyprus, it's not uncommon to find domesticated cat bones found in burials in other parts that were not directly controlled by Egypt, but were heavily influenced. The same way in Crete or the Levant, where Israel is today, and even up into Greece. They're extremely rare, but now that we know how to look for them and how to distinguish domesticated cats versus the wilder cats that were living in Southern Europe at that time, we're seeing that these things were probably exported quite often. So, why were they domesticating cats? Well, I mean, this is an agricultural economy, right? You have large, vast storages of grain, right? And where you store large amounts of grain and barley and other things like that, you have problems with rats. And when you have problems with rats, you need cats, right? So that's one of the reasons why the cat was slowly brought into Egyptian life. It probably did a lot of this on its own. As you have large storages of grain, you have rats, and the African wildcat and his hunting things would probably have just figured out to just associate. If you could just wait around these grain stores and just hunt the rats without being captured as a pet, and then slowly transitioned into becoming a domesticated animal. The same way with the dog. A dog was something 10,000 years before this started to hang around human encampments and eat the things that we couldn't do. The bones, the marrow on the inside, things that we would kind of throw away. Dogs found out that was a very easy meal, so they began to associate with human encampments. So cats did a similar process once agriculture started to really take off. So, okay, so we'll move into here. This is one of the more popular exhibits in Egyptian Hall. This is a reproduction of a middle-class person's tomb, Senejim's tomb, and how it might have looked like at a smaller scale, and what particular things would have gone into the tomb for this person to take into the afterlife. We're lucky with Senejim because the person that had this tomb was also a tomb builder. So this person probably constructed their own tombs, and if current theories are correct, a lot of the Egyptian tombs that were looted throughout the Egyptian period was because the people that built them knew how to get back into them. So that was probably part of the life cycle of the Egyptian tomb as these things were sealed and forgotten about several centuries after the person died. The Egyptian tomb builders, who knew where they were and what was being occupied and what wasn't being occupied, knew how to get back into them. This also is what probably preserved this tomb to such a degree, is that I guess you could say it was honor among thieves. You don't break into other Egyptian tomb robbers' tombs. So that's probably why it was preserved to the state it was. So the artifacts that are in here are not associated with Sennacherib himself. So these are just examples from different collections that were placed in here to give people an idea of what one person would need in the afterlife. So first of all, you would have had several individuals buried in here, up to 12 or 14 sometimes, as these things begun to fill in. The wood sarcophagus that you see here are kind of wholesale copies, or not copies, but actually they were mass-marketed, non-specific sarcophagus. One of them is this one here in the center is just listed as the Chantress of Amun, without a name. So a lot of upper class females in Egyptian culture, part of their duties was to sing in the choir of a given god, in this case Amun, and that was their official title. That was one of their jobs that they had to do outside of the home, and so they were often buried with that title. And there was enough of these that these could be produced wholesale, and then they would take that particular style of tomb for that particular style of job, and then just add the name towards the end. The name of this person is actually missing past the title, so it was probably either unused or it was hastily buried or some reason why the name wasn't added on before it was put into the tomb. So maybe they just simply forgot to do it, or they didn't pay the extra to have it inscribed. Who knows? But the other objects in here are pretty familiar. You have your standard red wares. You have your bronze mirrors. You have your vials of all various different sizes. A lot of these had to do with perfume and makeup. Both men and women wore makeup in Egyptian culture. A lot of these things developed practically. The dark eyeshadow that was put around the eyes, this is done for the same reason that football players do it today, was to actually control the amount of sun. The white powder that would have been put, that was to protect the body from the sun. So, namely, there's a practical reason not to be sunburned, but there was also a reason to stay lighter skinned. This showed that you didn't have to work outside. So this showed that you lived a life inside. So if you were tan, that showed that you spent more time outside working in the fields, and that you were less wealthy. Pretty much the opposite of today. So if you can have time for sunbathing and suntanning, it shows that you have more free time than a person that does not. So other objects that would have been placed in here would have been the shabti, which are these little creatures or little figurines that are often added to tombs. These were the replacements for Egyptian servants. So if you were a servant in ancient Egypt, the last thing you wanted to do in the afterlife was spend an eternity as a servant. So you're not going to sell anybody on going to the afterlife if they just had this same type of lifestyle that they had now. So you could buy, or your owner could buy a replacement, which are these little statues. A lot of them have incantations on how to bless the person that this is going to replace, how to activate it, or specific instructions for this Shabti to do. What was the purpose of this servant? So the scale of these things has always been a mystery to me. I don't know if they were supposed to increase to a larger size, or you add water like a chia pet and they just grow. In the case of the Egyptian boat, that boat, the model boat, was also supposed to represent a living boat in the next life. So if the model worked, why do you need the actual larger boat? So what's the difference between the two? That's a big question. If you could have smaller things to scale, houses, food, servants, boats, why did certain upper class need the full things, the actual things? So someone's getting cheated here. So, but anyways, you could buy as many of these things as you liked. A lot of tombs have specific amounts, 365. So one for every day of the year. Which also told us a lot about the Egyptian calendar system. They knew that there were 365 days in the year. So that was an important piece that Shabtis actually gave to us. The other objects that you will see in Egyptian tombs is the canopic jars. So these are the cylindrical jars with heads on top that represent the various gods of that particular organ, and what went inside. So usually, not always, it was the heart, the lungs, the liver or the kidneys, and the small intestines. There's a lot of variation depending on what part of Egypt you were living in. So there was no conforming dogma to Egyptian religion. So different cities along the Nile would have different versions of their afterlife. Some insisted that the liver was the most important, so you had to stick the liver in there, and they throw out the kidneys. Other times they would take the kidney and leave the liver, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of variation. And when I'm on tours, sometimes I get corrected on this, and I have to remind people that there was 5,000 years of change, and then there was 500 miles of change too. There was a lot of difference in these stories. So sometimes students or the public will have a certain version of that, and they think that's the only fixed version of that. And just kind of give like a contemporary version on modern religions. How much variation is there in Christianity today? You know, how much variation is there in Islam? So that shows you that there's not just one way of looking at these things. I try to take people back into this contemporary Egyptian lifestyle, that this was a fluid culture, not just a fixed version of itself, and that these things were in constant flux. So one thing that the Egyptians didn't save was the brain. They didn't know what it was. So they actually would remove the brain by taking a long metal rod with a little bent hook on the end. They'd put it up through the nose, and they'd liquefy the brain enough, and then they'd pull the brain out and throw it away. They just didn't know what it was. They thought that the heart was the center of the body, and that's where the mind was centered in. So, which was an important part of the Egyptian afterlife process. So, what's really cool about what Sennacherib had on his tomb walls was all the things that he was supposed to have done and is going to have done through his life and in the afterlife process. So this included being mummified properly, and paying homage to the gods, paying homage to the pharaohs. This wasn't done just as decoration. This was actually done so when the goddess Ma'at, the goddess of judgment, came down to take the ka, the part of the soul going to the afterlife. She would see these things, I guess, as kind of like advertisements, as billboards. You know, you did all the things that you were supposed to do, therefore you must be a good person. So, and one of these things that was included in this process was actually playing a board game, so called Sonnet. So we'll take a look at it in the resource room, but it was a small game with a certain number of pieces, kind of like kind of about a quarter size of a modern checkers board. We don't know exactly how it was played, and this was played as a form of recreation in ancient Egypt, usually in sonnet houses, which also doubled as taverns. So you would have a beer and play sonnet during the evening. But you were also practicing sonnet to play the Egyptian goddess Ma'at in the afterlife. So, and that's about all we know about that situation. So, I think that's incredibly peculiar and a little stressful if you have to play a god at a board game. You know, there's hopefully it was like when you're playing your parents at chess or something. They just kind of let you win. You know, as long as you tried, maybe they would let you pass. But that was one of the actions. And one of the other actions was that she would weigh your heart against the feather. So, and if your heart was full of guilt from not doing the goodly tasks in your life, giving to the poor, and not cheating your neighbor and things like that, then your heart was light enough and you were allowed to go to the afterlife. If not, it incinerated into nothing and poof, you're gone. No more afterlife for you. So that was part of the Egyptian belief system into getting into the afterlife. The other two parts of the soul, the Egyptian soul, divided into three parts, could do a number of things. Part of your soul could go and literally wander around the world in a kind of ghostly realm. And then the other one that was kind of attached to the body was the one that had to be fed. So that was the part of the ka that needed to be served food on a fairly regular basis. So, all right, I guess we'll move on. So these are actual Egyptian mummies that were intentionally mummied. These are later mummies from the Ptolemaic period. So this is kind of like after the Egyptian period and part of the Greek Empire that Alexander the Great founded. During this time, a lot of ancient Greeks migrated into Egypt. Namely in northern Egypt, a lot of them were brought into Alexandria as administrators. They would bring their families. And eventually, because of the wealth of ancient Egypt, a lot of Greek farmers would move down there and purchase property and live as Egyptians. Which is really cool about this is that this mummy of a child was found in a tomb of, I think it was 12 individuals, 7 adults, and 5 children. So it was not common practice to typically bury children in ancient Egypt. This was children usually had a lower life expectancy until a certain age. This is concurrent with the type of burial that it was found in. There was a number of children buried in here. This might have been an epidemic. There might have been some sort of red algae bloom or some other thing that was happening to the Nile at this time that caused a lot of children to die. But in any case, this child was loved enough to actually have gone through the mummification process. And so it is not related to the adult that's been buried here. This is also a totemic burial. Later, they were just following Egyptian fashion. This is kind of the this type of burial, this type of mummification process was kind of the quicker version of it, where they would use a lot of gesso and plaster and cover the body in that way. It erodes easily. You can see actually on this side of the body, there's a couple of fingers that have eroded out of the wrappings. So little kids like to see that. They can actually get to see the dead fingers. So which is kind of cool. So, and then we have over here another sarcophagus. And so this was probably Potomac or early Roman. So we know that by the color of the tomb. Light pinks and reds were introduced into sarcophagus fashion during this period. The Egyptians normally didn't do that. That was kind of a Roman thing. This guy, we don't know exactly who it is, but some of the inscriptions, the Demotic inscriptions on the side, say it was the son of somebody named Apater, or the Egyptian equivalent to Peter. So it's the son of Peter. So, but this is, even though this is mostly a gesso and plaster tomb, you can see in how much detail has actually gone into forming this outer part of the sarcophagus. And this is after thousands of years of fading. So this thing would have been, I don't want to say like hot pink, but it definitely would have been very bright. So very, very showy. So, let's see, over here we have a couple examples of the tops of the canopic jars, in this case alabaster. And then we also have these little statuettes of Osiris in this case. These were used by most of the population because they were not allowed into the tomb, into the temples themselves. So they would have made small shrines for these things, or they would have been offered to the gods themselves as an offering in exchange for a favor or a prayer. And so I guess that's all we have for this time. So one thing that Josh reminded me of is these really weird periods in Egyptian culture. One of the stories that we're familiar with is we're familiar with the Israelite exodus out of ancient Egypt, which does have some light correlations. During that period in ancient Egypt, if you're confronted on that type of story that's being told, there are several migrations that were coming in and out of Egypt at this time during these centuries. One of the other ones that we're familiar with is the Palestinian migration. What are today considered ethnic Palestinians have origins in southeastern Europe, and during this period of Akhenaten, there was several migrations coming from southern Europe into Egypt to avoid a famine. They had the ability to, Egypt was known in the ancient world for its really high abundance of agriculture. So if people were starving, they came to Egypt to kind of, as a last resort on to where to start over. And the Egyptian pharaohs during this 200-year period didn't want these migrations coming in. And they also controlled part of the Levant at this time. And they said, well, you can't stay here, but we'll send you up to the Levant and you can migrate and settle in those areas. So a lot of the many cultures that are mentioned in the early parts of the Bible with Moses, who came from Egypt, mentions these pockets of people that were sent up to the Levant. They were kicked out of Egypt proper and sent to these peripheral regions. So when the Israelite migration entered into Egypt, they were in succession of a lot of these different groups that were in contact at that time. So there is some historical non-biblical sources for those migrations going into the Levant from Egypt. So the other weird thing about this was the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. So he was an 18th dynasty pharaoh, and we don't know exactly how it started. A lot of it is believed to be stemming from his wife, Nefertiti, who had a preference for a certain type of worship for the sun god. So, and how it manifested through the Aten disk. A lot of the images that you see of Akhenaten as a pharaoh went totally against the grain of anything that had come before or after that. Most Egyptian pharaohs, no matter what they looked like, their physique and their physical structure, they were still given this kind of generic pharaoh look. So it was a type of architecture that was given to the pharaohs, a type of statues that were given. And Akhenaten wanted what he actually looked like carved into stone. So you can tell, you can compare the statue of Ramses to Akhenaten. You can see that he has a slender face, a longer chin, not like that stylized regular pharaoh look. And if we have an image of the entire Akhenaten body, you'll see that he was kind of slender, but he also had kind of a beer belly, and he insisted that this is carved into his statue. So he's kind of a lanky guy with a beer belly, and this was carved into those statues. So he wanted actual imagery of what he looked like, not these typesets of Egyptian pharaohs. So he also upset the entire Egyptian pantheon by insisting that all of Egypt stop worshiping all of the different gods and only worship one god. He tried to change Egypt in a period of about 5 years from a polytheistic society to a monotheistic society. So this did not go over well at all. As I was talking about over there, the Egyptian religious system was also a major component of the economy. So you were shutting down about 1/3 of the economy and putting all of those somewhat wealthy priests out of a job. So there was a huge resistance to this, and part of what Akhenaten did was he moved the capital from Memphis to a new site, which is now called El Amara, and tried to focus and concentrate the Egyptian hierarchy to worship this one god. So after he died, there was a minor rebellion, a kind of a revolution or counter-revolution actually, to go back and to the old system of worshiping all the Egyptian gods. And so they didn't like this at all. Any imagery that they have, that we have of Akhenaten, is extremely very rare. And so a lot of the images of Akhenaten themselves were things that were cast into the desert and buried. They got rid of those things. Or in the case of the sundial, they were so upset at this action that they actually destroyed a lot of this iconography. So we're very lucky to have one of these pieces that we can attribute to that time period, because immediately after that, a lot of these things were just obliterated, destroyed. And that was a way of ritually killing Akhenaten's memory and the worship of the sun goddess. They were just trying to redact that and erase that from the Egyptian memory. So it's very interesting that we have some things from that period. So the other cool things that are in this case is that we have a very, very small faience pendant from Hatshepsut, which is one of the female Egyptian pharaohs. So it wasn't common, but it wasn't unusual to occasionally have a female pharaoh in the Egyptian pantheon. So this only happened about 5 or 6 times in the entire Egyptian period. The Cleopatra line is the direct bloodline that we are familiar with at the end of the Egyptian period is probably the most famous Egyptian pharaoh. But the Hatshepsut was actually the mother of another pharaoh, and when that pharaoh was too young to actually rule, she took control of that, and she kind of held on to that realm of power. A more modern example would be how Catherine the Great in Russia kind of took control of some of the after Peter the Great. There was a couple of weak pharaohs in between Peter the Great and Catherine II, and that allowed for a very strong woman in Egyptian culture to take advantage of that and take control of that. So we do have some examples of that. Unfortunately, we only have this small pendant. So the other interesting thing in here is this Egyptian votive, which is kind of a type of clock. So it's kind of a type of water clock. Egyptians measured time by the hour, and they could do so at a 24-hour period. We're familiar with the Egyptian sundial, which they would use as a shadow clock to measure the hours during the day. At night, certain rituals had to be done in the temple at certain hours. This could be measured by looking at the starscape over the course of the night, and by water clocks that would leak water at a certain amount of time and mark certain hours during the day or during the night. So this is kind of like that. There's not enough water in here to even mark 1 hour of drainage. So this might have been used to mark a few minutes or a quarter of an hour, which could have been used as a certain amount of time that someone could enter into the temple. So this isn't exactly an Egyptian water clock, but it functions in the same way.
It's a night timer.
Yeah.
It's a night timer.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could actually measure time like that. It's a short amount of time. So we just don't know exactly what that was used for in the temple. So, yeah, that's all I had to mention in here. This is often the first thing people see when they're approaching the Egyptian hall. This is a 2-scale model of the Egyptian pharaoh Seti I giving an offering to the god Horus. So that in itself is kind of interesting, but what I'd like to show people with this example is that if you were an Egyptian living in this time period, this is what you would see. So this type of iconography at this scale is what helped separate the Egyptian pharaoh and the gods from the regular people. Most people never saw the pharaoh in person. All they saw were these large statues, these greater-than-life statues, and their relationship to the gods. So this is how Egyptians could actually perceive a human being as a god, because this is all they saw. They saw it at an equal scale with the known gods. They saw it brightly painted, and they saw it doing certain actions. So if this was all you saw of the pharaoh, it would be much easier for you to see the pharaoh as a god instead of just a person of your size and weight. And so it also shows how different Egypt looked than it does today. So if you go to Egypt today, you see a lot of bare sandstone, marble, granite, things like that, all these different stones which are beautiful in their own right, but all that stuff was painted. So it was painted to look like this. The columns were painted different colors. Egyptians, it's funny to think that Egyptians actually didn't trust the ability of stone. So they switched from making things out of wood when they exhausted their wood resources in Egypt to using stone as a replacement for wood. So if you look at a lot of early Egyptian column designs, they're actually carved to look like wood. So wood was the more expensive luxury, so you're kind of giving it that fancier look by making it look like wood. We almost do the opposite. We'll have fake marble countertops to make it look nicer. Because stone was so common, having something look like wood was the fancier version of that. So they didn't trust the ability of stone to hold up more stone, so they kept their columns nice and tight, the same distance that they kept them when they were using wood. So the column spacing in between the columns was very narrow compared to what the Romans and Greeks did. So they often carved the columns to look like reeds or stone or trees themselves, to kind of give it that trust of wood and not trust the stone itself. So sandstone fractures very easily too. So there was actually some legitimacy in not trusting some of the stones that they were using. So, but everything that you would have seen in the temple would have been done up like this. It would have been colored and painted. The roofs of the temples, the floors, the iconography, everything would have been brightly painted. So kind of like a town in the Caribbean where each house is kind of that different pastel. That would have been a good example of how bright and colorful their world would have been, not that plain stone. So, okay, we'll talk about Sekhmet here for a second. So these large statues do kind of the same thing. They give you a sense of scale of person to the object that they would have, or the god or the pharaoh they would have been in contact with. And it's also funny to point out that even though they had 5,000 years to get it right, Egyptians never really got canon down, artistic canon. So they would they would carve in how they perceived the body, not how it actually looked. So if you extend the arms of these statues, sometimes they were much longer than they would actually be. They thought that it looked better if they kept these longer designs in place, but this wasn't the Greek style where it was an actual representation of a person in proportion. Proportions didn't matter to ancient Greeks. You had longer toes, bigger feet, longer arms, disproportionate body size, but that's how they wanted it to look. That was a style that they were familiar with. So Sekhmet, you can see that she has the face of a lioness or a cat. So that this is another connection with the home and this goddess, to actually connect the ability of the cat to protect the home. If you have people on your tour that like cats, I always bring them here. So the cat physically protected the home by not allowing garbage and vermin to live in the home, but it was also developed in a kind of spiritual sense where it would protect the home in a very spiritual way. This statue is of Amenhotep III. kind of a famous pharaoh. He was an expansionist, so he expanded a lot of Egyptian territory, and he's also very familiar to us because this is also King Tut's grandfather. So this would have been, even though King Tut, that we're all familiar with, died at a very young age, didn't really do a lot. Politically, he was related to a very wealthy expansionist family, a very good dynasty at that time.
Any questions for Phillip?
I'm just fascinated by, I don't know how you miss these things, in life, but their obsession with their appearance.
Right.
And I somehow miss that. I mean, you know it, but really they spent, for that time period, an awful lot of time on hygiene and appearance. And
They were quite materialistic, yeah. So
now, the common people would not have done that, or would they?
well, they would have strived towards it.
Really?
Yeah. That's and that's really what I try. Like when I give a tour, I try to get people to understand. Like, chronologies and kingdoms and who was pharaoh at what time. That's something they can get out of a book. If they have a general idea of what that was, that's important. But really showing like the similarities between peoples is very important. It's someone that lived 5,000 years ago probably had the same thoughts and needs and wants as other people. They were people, and in archaeology, you really can't say too much more about the pharaohs. Everything has been pretty much extracted from who they were and what they did. And what archaeology is trying to do is fill in all of the unseen people. Whether it was just the merchants or the day laborers, the slaves, women, all of these different parts of society. That's what people are grasping at now, is trying to relate that to us, because we're the ones watching. We're the ones looking at it. So isn't it interesting to know what children were doing at this time, or what roles did women have at this time, and what was daily life like, things like that. So that's really close, trying to build those bonds between. That's what they take away too, not who was pharaoh the 13th dynasty, stuff like that.
So what would the funeral or burial practice have been for more common people?
What would have been the process? Like at the...
Were they mummified? Where were they buried?
Everyone was buried. So, and your degree of preservation depended on what you could afford. So, and you saw from the pre-dynastic burial, basic burial in the ground, little to no mummification, a couple of snacks, and that's it. That's what they could afford. So even those, if they could, buried with something to take to the afterlife. So a head start.
But what they were buried with might not have been mummified.
No. Well, not always. Yeah, it depends. So there's a huge spectrum of what could be afforded.
Kind of like today,
right?
The mausoleums that we see down in the cemetery versus...
the pauper cemetery with just a number on it. So, but everyone usually had burial. So, unless you didn't like the person. So, and then you could either remove the burial, which would ruin their afterlife. You could you could actually ruin someone's immortality by scratching out all their names. So they're forgotten. And when you're forgotten, people don't give you offerings, they don't give you food, ruining your afterlife. So there was a connection, even though the person was dead, there was still a connection with the living in a certain sense. So that's what built this high Egyptian moral system, that you had to be a good person, honor your ancestors, give to the poor and things like that. Because if you were a nice person, people generally didn't mess with your afterlife.
So if you were considered middle class, what type of occupation would you have, men or women?
Middle class would have been the merchant class or the shopkeepers class. Agricultural people were on the kind of the lower end of that, as opposed to like the urban middle class, the producers of ceramics and things like that. The lower middle class, the agricultural people, the Egyptian year was really set. So just their latitude made the day pretty much the same. The blue clear sky, that was, every day looked the same. So the sun came up at a certain point, went down to a certain point. You had the Nile running east and west. So you had cardinal directions between the sun and the river. And so every day kind of went the same. The agricultural, the flooding of the Nile happened the same time of year, flooded the Nile, inundated it for a certain amount of months. All of these agricultural farmers were then repurposed to go and work in the Egyptian, to build tombs or work for the pharaoh. So they were taxed in labor, much like the Inca system, where you were conscripted for a while, had to go work on the pyramid during the flooding months, and then you went back to agriculture. That's why they took 20 years to build in certain cases, because they were only working on it a certain amount of months. They weren't built by slaves. These were skilled craftsmen. They would build a town. Usually, if you're going to work on especially like the Great Pyramids that are going to take 20 or 30 years to build, a town would kind of grow up around it during the building process. So people would come from the Nile and then go and live in these towns for a couple of months and build the temple and then go back to what they were doing beforehand. And then they were paid for it. They were paid for it in goods. They paid for it in beer and other things that they were taking back for it. So it wasn't like it was absolute slavery or servitude. They did have those classes, but the pyramid builders were kind of a middle class level. So.
And the women, did they raise the children? Were they owned the children, or did they also work alongside?
Oh, they could. A lot of women would work outside the home. Upper class women often worked in the temples, in the choir and things like that, like the Chantress of Amun. That was a fairly common task, fairly common duty. The Egyptians had divorce. A male or a male or female could divorce the other if it wasn't working out. It was a fairly easy process. You had different types of craftswork. A lot of household level use, like if you were making linens or ceramics, those were done by the women at kind of a community level. So you would have like a community kiln, and all the women would make the pots and the linens and stuff like that. What's very interesting about weaving, in particular, is that worldwide, if it's the men weaving, they use vertical looms, the stuff that's weighted so it's a vertical thing that's weighted at the bottom. When women do the weaving in the culture, it's horizontal looms, and that's found all over the world, without exception. And there's no real reason why. One doesn't work better than the other one. But there's a book called Women Who Weave, and that's part of the book as it goes through there. And so because of that, those specific actions and stuff like that, when we find those artifacts, we know exactly who did it. So if pottery was being produced on an industrial scale for trade or by a temple, it was usually done by men for the exchangeable wares. And then if it was for a community level, it was done by women. So That's just
And then children too, did they reach a certain age and help?
yeah, they were usually incorporated past the age of 5 into whatever their family was doing at that time. So.
Thank you.
Did you say there was no money? Was it all a barter trade system?
Yeah, the Greeks introduced currency, coins. So before that, there is they had, didn't last very long, but they had something called an oxhide ingot bar, which was this bronze or copper in bullion form, and those were a set shape, and it kind of looked like a stretched out ox hide. These little nubs on the end, and it kind of had like this, like figure 8 shape with tabs on the end. And those were kind of the precursor for money, because they were a set weight and a set shape. And those could be exchanged kind of as like a giant coin. They're usually about this big. The Kelso Museum of Near Eastern Archaeology actually has one. So if you ever want to go take a look. Before that, it was barter. So whatever the different weights and values of things were compared to different stuff. So there's a lot of Egyptian weights. They had a very complicated weight system for measuring, how much grain is worth, how much pots. There was a set exchange rates for these things.
So the diorama that's in the center of the room, and the men were making the beads, and there was a scale. Those gold rings, were they weights, or was that something separate?
Yeah, that was a weighted system probably for the exchange of that value in gold, stuff like that. So, there's no currency.
There was like a central number that everything was quantified by?
A set, yeah, and this was like any other market system. It fluctuated with quality and with time and stuff like that. But there was a lot of Egyptian writing as lawsuits. People were writing down recording information they thought they were cheated in certain cases, and so they would go to a magistrate. Magistrates were often not a separate judge, but like kind of a mayor judge system, and they would go with a formal complaint that they got cheated. And so a lot of our information of what was worth what comes out of that legal system. So, and customer complaints, lots of customer complaints. So written complaints on so-and-so was supposed to deliver 10 amphoras of olive oil and they only gave me 6, or it was a bad quality, or I could tell that you added water to this, I know you cheated me. So things like that. A lot of legal transcripts.
What about war and who their enemies might have been? I can't imagine civilization being exist for 5,000 years and having a lot of enemies to constantly fight with. Is there any knowledge as to that?
Yeah, they had standing disputes with people in the south, the Nubians, that would come up and raid. There was also several ventures throughout these thousands of years to expand the Egyptian empire further down the Nile. And sometimes it worked and they would control certain areas. And then there was even some cases where the Nubians actually had a counter attack and would take over parts of Upper Egypt for a while. The deserts on either side were like our oceans for the U.S. They protected them. But there was nomadic incursions, things like that. And then during the Middle and New Kingdom, when the Hittites started to really gain power as an empire in modern-day Turkey, they fought constant, heavy, like World War, regional wars with the Hittites, usually over the conquered territories like the Levant and places like that, they would fight. And those were actually, not these skirmish battles, but actually two large armies facing at each other with generals and archers and chariots and stuff like that. So, and then eventually the Egyptians were conquered by the Persians, and then the Greeks after that during the Ptolemaic period. So, anything else? Yeah.
Now, since we have you here, so I would love to know your answer, because I get this question on tour a lot. Is it okay for the Carnegie to display human remains? How do you answer that question?
Is it okay?
I'm thinking like a student
yeah.
would ask me, is this okay?
Yeah. It is. It is and it isn't. So it depends on our beliefs and feelings with displaying a human body as an object, and almost more importantly, if the host culture displays, or how do they feel about it. So that's why it's not cool to have American Indian bodies on display. That's not considered okay. So those are considered the sacred bones of their ancestors. That's also why we don't display our own dead. We don't have people from the 17th century on display. A lot of times we can trace the lineage, and they don't want their ancestor on display, which makes an exception with the Egyptians. Is that there's the modern Egyptian equivalent. There's a lot of mummies on display in Egypt, and those are the cultural inheritance stewards from that period, and the closest link, the Egyptian Coptic people, don't seem to have a problem with it either. So there's kind of I wouldn't call it permission, but it's not considered offensive to show the dead from that period. And there's also the duration of time between now and then, 5,000 years. This isn't really showing anybody's descendant per se, so it's okay. And if there's something to be learned from it that can help us understand that person in particular, or the culture that's behind that, that's probably maybe an okay thing with that person's ka. So especially if you have like the child and the different full mummies that we have on the display, that shows you the fragileness of life, right? That especially kids, like, you're lucky to be alive past the age of 5. You made it. It shows you how precious life can be, and how dangerous and tough life could be for these individuals. And then also, if you think about it, it plays into the Egyptian sense of immortality. So thousands of years after these individuals died, they're still being talked about, they're still being looked at, they're still being regarded in a certain sense. So that's exactly what they wanted when they were put into these tombs, was immortality, and by remembering them, we're doing that. So it probably plays right into their religious motifs.
And alongside that question, how do you, I'm curious what your techniques are. You'll get a group of, say, 6th graders. A couple of girls are like, oh, mummies, and they start getting a little worked up.
Yeah.
I don't want to see them, What are your tips and techniques for all of us to...
Well, I usually ask before I even get close.
Okay.
So I make sure that they know what they're getting into. And if they're younger, I'll just ask them, you guys want to see a dead body? Or no. And if no, okay, that's fine. So also, if they specifically requested the Egyptian culture on the tour, I talked to the chaperones. I was like, you requested Egypt, you're aware that we have physical human remains on display. Do you want to see that? No. That usually dictates right away what we're doing, if I'm looking at that or not. And then if I actually get there, and I have very rarely had issues where they'll actually see the body and didn't have an issue with it. So, and usually the chaperone is the person that comes in and kind of takes the person away until we move on from that. So most of the excitement's in the other direction, and just get too worked up about it.
In advance.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and you have to kind of rein it in a little bit and remind them that this is a human body, so, and to be respectful of it. So, and then they kind of tone it down a little bit.
I can tell you what I do is I ask my group to imagine, or ask them, a lot of students today have been to memorial services or funerals, and I'll say, you know, if you've been to a memorial service or a funeral for someone you really cared about, that's how I start.
Yeah.
And it just takes the temperature right down, most of the time. That's how I do it.
Just to add that I rarely had a problem. Usually people were really interested. Usually they want to know if it's real or not. Sometimes
Yeah.
they are not sure if it's real. But it seems to me it comes down to a matter of, is this a respectful way to treat a person or not? And if it becomes a topic, which it rarely does, I'll say, you know, in my experience, archaeologists, anthropologists, and museums treat human remains with more respect than often human remains are treated on the street or in cultures.
Yeah.
So these are remains that have gotten they've been very carefully handled and treated with the utmost of respect.
Absolutely.
Very special.
So, because they're treated with respect as the physical representation of a person, and also for the extreme amount of knowledge that can be taken from these things, especially with modern isotope analysis in teeth and bones, we're now able to tell where a person lived. We can tell if a person was raised in the mountains and had a certain diet, and then at the age of 5, their family moved to the coast, and then moved somewhere else, because all that is recorded in your bones and your teeth. So,
Since the hall's open, have you ever removed them for any reason?
I don't know if I've ever.
Well, they did to X-ray.
Okay.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
experience with that has been, before this configuration here, Egypt was in the back of the building, in the curved section above the lecture hall, where our offices used to be. I remember as a child, a girl being here for art classes and going out to look at the pre-dynastic burial. That was in a similar kind of case.
Yeah.
I would suspect that when the hall was done, and probably Deb Hardy could tell us this because she's been around for quite a while, I would assume that the mummies were conserved in some way, you know, examined. At least I know the child mummy was CAT scanned about 10 years ago. So it is ongoing to make sure that they are not, you know, they don't deteriorate. I know, you know, Gretchen can talk to us at some point and tell us about what their methods are to make sure that things remain in that way.
Yeah.
Conservation doesn't mean improving them, just keeping them stable.
Stable.
Yeah.
Yeah. They have gel pads underneath them. I call them mummy diapers, because they're like the gel pads you hang in your closet to absorb water. They absorb all the moisture. So, huh?
That's what I wondered about.
Yeah. So that's why they're behind in those cases with the gauges set in there, is to keep them exactly how they are supposed to. And which is basically to mimic what goes on in Egypt. Egypt did an awesome job of keeping them for thousands of years. We just have to mimic those circumstances. So.
I have 2 more for you if you've got the time. Oh, we've got the time. So are there any terms we should all avoid or that you can think of? Like, and when I'm talking about not just ancient Egypt, but Polar World and American Indian Hall. In your experience that you're...
There are, let's see if I can recall, some, it's, I guess the most sensitive issue right now is when people try, and when I'm explaining the Egyptian burial process or how they treated the dead, and modern Moors will come on top of that, you know, as being offensive. You know, especially if you're talking about differences between sex and race and classes like that. They didn't live like we did. And I don't gloss over what happened in the past. I don't think that serves anybody to try and make something out of what was happening there. So some of the things that I'll say, you know, the way they would treat slaves, or the way that the differences in gender were approached, can sometimes be offensive. But I'm trying to show that there's a difference in the cultures, you know, what's similar and what's different. So, but I always preface that with, you know, trying to walk people into it and say that there's a difference between these two different cultures in past and location. So before I start talking about it. So, but that's with older groups anyways, you know, with high school and college age like that. So the terms, you know, American Indian, you know, will often be corrected as opposed, why don't you say Native American? And then I remind them of how the hall was developed. You know, that they were consulted with the different groups that came in here. And this was the version that they chose. And even these versions, American Indian, Native American, you're still using the American word. This isn't the name that they garnished themselves. Unless I have to refer to the entire hall, I always refer to the culture specifically. So, and if Egyptians were, you know, ancient Egyptians had any say in the input, they would want to be referred to from their city, from their origin. You know, I'm not from Thebes, I'm from Memphis. You know, I don't like those jerks. So there was a difference in those types too, but of course, you know, that wouldn't come up. But
Okay, so my last question, and this is help for all of us here. How do you do 3 cultures in 1 hour? Do you have any tips for the whole group?
how do you do 3 cultures?
3 cultures in 1 hour. What are your best tips? I mean,
Ooh, yeah, I always weight it to what they're interested in. So which varies. So, and I will, if they want a little bit more Egypt, you know, I'll give, you know, 25 minutes instead of 20 minutes and stuff like that. I always try to come in here at some point so they can use these and touch these objects. They can see what the pillow would feel like, and the Senet game and things like that. So I'll try and spend no more than 5 minutes in here, and then it really depends on, especially on everything on this side. You know, what are their major interests? So sometimes I will dabble with Lakota and the Hopi and the Tlingit to show differences. You know, if this is more of a climate and culture thing that we're doing, then you want to show these different adaptations or these different ways people use their resources. Or if it's, you know, more if we're learning about Native, you know, American Indians because it's Thanksgiving. So I'll go into more what's around our area. Think, you know, the Iroquois, the Lakota, and stuff like that. And I always try to tell them that these are snapshots of cultures, and that the museum's old enough that when these things were collected, they were modern, they were contemporary. These, you know, you'll see dates of 1890, 1913. That's when the museum garnished these things, and they're old now, but when they were taken, they were brand new. And so, you know, when I go into the polar world, I make sure that they see the modern polar world too. You know, that this is how they lived, and that all cultures change, and this is how they are now. You know, this isn't. If you go to the Arctic today, don't expect to see people living in igloos. So, so that's always a portion of it as well. So, but it really depends on what I try and go with the tide, whatever take they want on it. So sometimes I don't always get to Hopi. You know, if they're really interested in the Lakota, we'll stay in the Lakota. So, and even the Lakota, they were a migratory nomadic culture, but that was only for about 60 years. when Lewis and Clark came across those same groups, they were camped out on the Missouri River. They were sedentary farmers. They were driven into the plains, where they have their reservations now, and then they're sedentary again. So even that 60 years of being horseback nomadic buffalo hunters was only like a small portion of their culture. So, and to remember that, and that's not all of who they are. So, and that they're still alive. So that's a big thing. So a lot of people don't realize that there are Native people in the U.S. all over the place.